The modern age in English poetry, generally beginning after the end of the Victorian age, that is 1901, through the two world wars into the mid of the century, we call that the modern age. The modern age, generally, when we think of it, we think of poets like T.S. Eliot maybe Yeats, maybe Hopkins, and many more. I'm talking about the British poets. We have today a poet, not so well known, but who was writing in the same period. I want to draw your attention to the fact that this period saw a variety of themes, a variety of styles, experimentation, etc. Gone were the days when poetry was written according to a canon. Shirley Toulson, 1924 to 2018, was a poet as well as a journalist, and she did do some prose writing too. She was part of a group called, interestingly, The Group, which consisted of a number of informal poets. She did write poetry, but she also wrote what we call walking routes, a number of writings about the places that one could visit if one set out on a walking tour. She wrote something called Celtic Journeys, Shadows in an Orchard, and also some short stories. It's interesting that we are today going to be looking at a poem that she wrote, A Photograph. Let me begin by reading the poem, A Photograph. The cardboard shows me how it was when the two girl cousins went paddling, each one holding one of my mother's hands. And she, the big girl, some 12 years or so. All three stood still to smile through their hair at the uncle with a camera, a sweet face, my mother's. That was before I was born, and the sea, which appears to have changed less, washed their terribly transient feet. Some of you, maybe our younger viewers and listeners, might not even understand the concept of a photograph in a cardboard box. What does that mean? Well, I'm talking of maybe half a century ago, when we had photographs which we printed out, can you imagine? And some of them, of course, went into albums. But sometimes there were too many, so we didn't buy albums. So we kept them, what we said, loose, and kept them in cardboard boxes. So on a vacation in grandma's house, it would be a lovely pastime to pull out some of those photographs and try to identify the people in that photograph. Interesting, because we are looking at people who we did not see when they were that age. So here is a cardboard box, and there is a picture, a photograph of three girls. And the poet tells us that there were two girl cousins and her mother. The mother was the bigger of the two, the older of the two. She was probably 12 years. And I'm wondering if listeners, readers, viewers, we still say cheese when we are ready for a photograph. So that's what they were doing here. Whoever was taking the photograph, our poet imagines that it was probably an uncle. And so the photograph is being taken, and the uncle probably says, "Smile, please." And therefore they are smiling into the camera. And the poet says that my mother was much younger then. And where are they? They are on a beach. And then she remembers that the mother is the older of the three, the eldest of the three. And they're probably on the beach because she talks about how the sea seems to change much less than human beings do. The mortality of human beings is drawn here because in part 2 she says, some 20-30 years later, she'd laugh at the snapshot. "See Betty and Dolly," she'd say. And look how they are dressed for the beach. The sea holiday was her past. Mine is her laughter. So the mother is no more. But the daughter still remembers when the mother was alive and she was looking at this photograph and laughing at the memory. You know, we do that. When we look at a photograph, so much of when that photograph was taken comes back to our mind. And so the mother looks at it maybe 20, 30 years later. So if the mother was not even in her teens when the photograph was taken, she's now in her 40s. She looks at it and remembers the holiday and also thinks of how her cousins were dressed. Maybe they came from different backgrounds and therefore the cousins seem to be overdressed according to the mother. So she says, the sea holiday was her past, mine is her laughter. Both wry with the labored ease of loss. Loss of the mother's childhood, and now for the poet, the loss of her mother. Now she's been dead nearly as many years as that girl lived. So 10, 12, 15 years after her mother's death. That's part 3 of the poem where she says, and of the circumstance, there's nothing to say at all. It's silence, silences. So it's a beautiful poem, beginning with a photograph. But then the photograph takes you down the journey of life. So you look at the mother, the poet looks at the mother, sees her mother young, looks at her mother looking at the photograph when she's still alive. And now it is the poet looking at the photograph of the mother, but the mother is dead. I think it's a simple poem, but the poem is really about the mortality. The poem is about memories. The poem is about loss. The poem is about how one looks at someone else's past and what it does to you to realize that the mother is no more with her. The poem does have a few figures of speech, and as I think it's become a habit with me to say, I'm not going to repeat the oft repeated ones. I think this is in a way telling you to go back and listen to some of our earlier lectures where you will find many of these figures of speech explained with examples. So we have alliteration, which you know what it means, and therefore I'm not going to talk about it. But there's something called the transferred epithet. We have come across it in a poem or two, where the poet transfers a quality which we associate with a human being maybe to something else. For example, my favorite one is the weary way. The way, the route, the path is not tired, but the traveler who's walking is tired, and you call it the weary way. Here there is a transferred epithet when she talks about terribly transient feet. The feet are not transient, right? It is life. It is human life which is transient. There is also the oxymoron. Again, we have come across it in earlier lectures. Oxymoron is the placing of opposites next to each other. For example, if you talk about cruel kindness, think of it when somebody's leg is amputated, because if it's not amputated, the patient is likely to die, and therefore we call it cruel kindness. So here you have an oxymoron in labored ease. You also have personification in a line like, in a phrase like, silence silences. I'd like you to read the poem again to see how beautifully the poet concludes the poem by talking about silence silences. Look for the common ones and look for the not so common ones whenever you read a poem, because poetry becomes greater because of the figures of speech. Remember, I'm not saying only because of the figures of speech, but also because of the figures of speech. I just realized I was looking at photographs on my mobile and wondering what a long, long way we've come. Yes, what do? Go back, walk down memory lane and read poems about the past. about memories, about remembering a visit to a grandfather's house, two cousins on a swing, and ever so many more. The past is a part of the present, and that's what poetry reminds us about. Happy reading!